On November 15, 2017, a road opened to the top of the world. The Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway, 138 kilometers of gravel and engineering, became Canada's first permanent link to the Arctic Ocean. It was a national triumph, a symbol of sovereignty, a lifeline built on what was believed to be unshakable ground. Today, parts of that highway are failing, not from overuse, not from sabotage, but from the ground itself giving way beneath it. The road is slumping, buckling, and sinking into a landscape that is no longer solid. Billions of dollars of infrastructure, designed to last generations, is built on a foundation of ice, and that ice is now melting. And the strangest part of this story is not that a highway is sinking. It is that the same process is threatening to erase an entire town from the map. A community that has existed for centuries on the coast of the Beaufort Sea is watching its world dissolve, meter by meter, into the cold, dark water. To understand what is happening in the Canadian North, you have to understand the ground itself. For millennia, nearly half of Canada's landmass, some 4.4 million square kilometers, has been held together by permafrost. It is a layer of soil, rock, and ice that has remained at or below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 consecutive years. It is less a feature of the landscape and more the landscape itself, the foundation on which everything rests. But the Arctic is now warming at a rate 2 to 3 times the global average. Since 1948, the average temperature in northern Canada has risen by 2.3 degrees Celsius. And this seemingly small change has triggered a geological breakdown on a continental scale. The process begins in the summer, in what is called the active layer. This is the top section of ground that thaws each year. As temperatures climb, that thaw goes deeper, reaching the ice-rich permafrost below. This permafrost, in regions like the Mackenzie River Delta, is not just frozen soil. It can be up to 80% pure ice by volume. Ice wedges, massive vertical sheets of ice formed over thousands of years, run through the earth like the skeleton of the land. When this ice melts, it does not just make the ground wet. It removes its very structure. The water drains away, and the land above it collapses. The result is a landscape called thermokarst. The ground becomes a chaotic jumble of pits, mounds, and small shifting lakes. The forests begin to tilt as the earth subsides unevenly beneath them, creating an eerie phenomenon known as a drunken forest. It's a strange thing to think about, the ground itself moving. Curious what your first thought is seeing a forest leaning sideways. Because it is not a metaphor, it is a physical reality happening right now across millions of acres. This is the force working against the Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk Highway. The road was built as a massive insulating berm, in some places nearly 2 meters thick, designed to protect the permafrost underneath from the summer sun. Yet the ground is warming anyway. The highway is slumping in sections, requiring constant, expensive maintenance. Engineers are in a never-ending battle, patching collapses and trying to reinforce a road built on a melting foundation. In a bizarre twist, the insulation in some sections has worked too well, drawing so much heat out of the ground that the permafrost has begun to grow upwards, creating new bumps in the road from expanding ice lenses. The highway is being attacked from above and below. But here is the detail that tells the real story. The highway ends in a town of about 900 people and a Nunavut hamlet called Tuktoyaktuk. For centuries, its people have lived on a narrow peninsula jutting into the Beaufort Sea. Their homes, their school, their history, their ancestors buried in the town graveyard, all sit on the same ice-rich permafrost. And the same thaw that is buckling the highway is eating their coastline alive. Erwin Elias is the mayor of Tuktoyaktuk. He has become the voice of his community, pleading with the outside world to understand the urgency of their situation. We're at the forefront of climate change, he has stated. Our community is at risk of falling into the ocean. It's happening, and it's happening fast. Dustin Whalen, a physical scientist with the Geological Survey of Canada, has spent years documenting the erosion. He explains that the problem is threefold. First, the thawing permafrost on the coast makes the shoreline weak and prone to collapse. Second, declining sea ice means the coast is no longer protected from the full force of ocean storms. And third, those storms are becoming more frequent and more powerful. The result is a coastline that is disappearing at an average rate of 1 to 2 meters every single year. During a single powerful storm, a chunk of land 20 meters deep can vanish in a matter of hours. At least 8 homes have already been lifted off their foundations and moved further inland. The town is in a slow-motion retreat. This is the part the headlines do not capture. The threat is not just to property, it is existential. One of the most vulnerable locations in Tuktoyaktuk is the point of land where the community's graveyard is located. The sea is advancing on the resting places of their parents and grandparents. To lose that land is to lose a piece of their soul. The fight to save Tuktoyaktuk is not about real estate. It is about preserving a culture. It is about holding on to a connection with the past in a place where the very ground is letting go. In August 2019, funding was announced for mitigation efforts. By May 2022, a major investment of nearly $65 million was committed to the Tuktoyaktuk Community Climate Resiliency Project. As of this year, work is actively underway. Giant barges are bringing in tons of rock armor, piling it along the most vulnerable sections of the coast, creating a barrier to blunt the force of the waves. It is a desperate, monumental effort. A small community on the edge of a continent, building a wall to hold back an ocean. The project is designed to offer protection for the next 50 to 60 years. But no one can say for certain if it will be enough. The forces at play are geologic in scale. Now, here is the part where the story deepens, where a local crisis reveals a continental pattern. Tuktoyaktuk's struggle is not isolated. Travel 737 kilometers south, along the Dempster Highway, the only other major road in the region, and you see the same story. The Dempster was an engineering marvel when it opened in 1979, built on a thick gravel pad to insulate the permafrost. Today, government reports state that more than 20% of that highway is at high risk of failure due to thaw. The cost of endless repairs is staggering. The Yukon and Northwest Territories governments are fighting a losing battle, installing thermosiphons, giant metal tubes that act like radiators to pull winter cold deep into the ground, and dumping endless tons of insulating rock fill on sections that continue to sink. It is a slow, grinding failure that exposes a fundamental mistake made by an entire generation of nation builders. We built a modern North on the assumption of permanence, on the idea that frozen ground was as stable as bedrock. Antoni Lukowicz, a leading permafrost expert from the University of Ottawa, has studied this for decades. He notes the inherent challenge: you put a dark asphalt road on top of permafrost. It absorbs the heat, you get thaw, the road subsides, and then you have to come back and put more material on top. It's a never-ending cycle of cost. The North's essential arteries are bleeding money as the ground they are built on turns to mud. This problem reaches every corner of life. In Old Crow, Yukon, the northernmost community in the territory and home to the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, the airport runway, their only connection to the outside world for much of the year, is being warped by permafrost thaw. Buildings across the region, constructed on shallow foundations a few decades ago, are now cracking and tilting. The total value of public infrastructure in Canada's territories at risk from this process is estimated at $136.6 billion. That is the cost of underestimating the ice. If you find this kind of deep dive into the forces reshaping our world interesting, you can subscribe. We post videos like this regularly. But the most compelling story of this unfolding crisis may be the story of a town that saw it coming 70 years ago. In the 1950s, the Canadian government looked at the community of Aklavik, a town of about 600 people in the heart of the Mackenzie Delta. They saw a place built on unstable, flood-prone ground. They saw a future of constant struggle against water and mud. So they made a decision. They would abandon the town and relocate everyone to a new master-planned community built on what their surveyors promised was more stable terrain. That new town was Inuvik. But the people of Aklavik refused to go. Their response became the town's official motto, a declaration of defiance against both the government and geology. Never say die. They stayed. And for decades they held on. Inuvik was built and became the administrative hub of the Western Arctic. But the irony is that today, Inuvik itself is not immune. Its buildings, many placed on stilts driven deep into the permafrost, are facing their own stability issues. And Aklavik's 70-year-old problem has become the entire region's reality. The government's prediction for that one small town in the 1950s was not wrong. It was just early. It's a powerful story of resilience. Low-key send this to a friend who appreciates that kind of history. Anyway, the fight they chose to wage then is the fight every northern community is now being forced to take on. The changes are not just structural, they are systemic. They are rewriting the very fabric of the ecosystem. Steve Kokelj, a scientist with the Northwest Territories Geological Survey, studies a phenomenon called thaw slumps. These are not the gentle subsidences that buckle highways. These are catastrophic landscape failures. A section of hillside, saturated with melted ice, suddenly gives way, creating a massive horseshoe-shaped scar on the land that can grow to the size of dozens of football fields. Some slumps in the Peel Plateau region have grown to over 40 hectares. Kokel describes them with chilling clarity. These are not subtle changes. They are catastrophic changes that are occurring on the timescale of years. These slumps pour millions of tons of mud, sediment, and organic material into rivers and lakes, choking out aquatic life and altering water chemistry for hundreds of kilometers downstream. They reroute ancient streams. They drain entire lakes. They fundamentally resculpt the land in a geologic instant. For indigenous communities, this means traditional hunting and travel routes, used for countless generations, become impassable or disappear entirely. The knowledge of the elders based on a stable landscape is being rendered obsolete by a world in flux. And then there is the discovery of what lies within the permafrost itself. The Great Thaw is acting like a planetary archaeological dig. In 2016, in the Klondike goldfields of the Yukon, a miner stumbled upon the perfectly preserved mummy of a 57,000-year-old wolf pup, which the local Trondequechene First Nation named Jur. Its fur, its teeth, its internal organs, all were intact. The permafrost is a frozen archive of ancient life, and that archive is now opening. Carcasses of woolly mammoths, steppe bison, and ancient horses are emerging from the melting mud. But this process unlocks something more than ancient fauna. It unlocks a climatic time bomb. Arctic permafrost is estimated to hold between 1,400 and 600 billion metric tons of organic carbon. That is the compressed remains of millennia of plant and animal life, locked in a deep freeze. It's almost twice the amount of carbon currently present in the entire Earth's atmosphere. As the permafrost thaws, microbes that have been dormant for eons wake up and begin to decompose this organic matter. In doing so, they release the stored carbon back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and, in waterlogged areas, methane, a greenhouse gas more than 25 times as potent as CO2 over a 100-year period. This is the part that takes a regional crisis and makes it a global threat. The warming melts the permafrost. The melting permafrost releases carbon and methane. Those gases accelerate the warming. This is a positive feedback loop, and it is firing up. A 2023 study published in the journal Nature Communications found that previous models had seriously underestimated the impact. They found that abrupt thaw events, like the catastrophic slumps studied by Steve Kokelj, could double the carbon emissions from the permafrost region compared to earlier estimates that only considered gradual sinking. The land itself is not just a victim of climate change, it is becoming an active accelerator of it. And beneath the blanket of sensational headlines, there is an even more complex geological process unfolding. The phrase, "Northern Canada is sinking," is both true and an oversimplification. In the Mackenzie Delta, the ground is indeed collapsing as ice-rich permafrost melts. But on the other side of the continent, around Hudson Bay, the ground is doing the exact opposite. It is rising. This is a process called glacial isostatic adjustment. During the last ice age, the sheer weight of multi-kilometer thick ice sheets pushed the Earth's crust down into the mantle, like a thumb pressing into a rubber ball. For the last 10,000 years, since that ice melted, the land has been slowly rebounding. In some places around Hudson Bay, the ground is still rising at a rate of over a centimeter per year. So you have this extraordinary planetary dynamic. One part of the country is being pushed up by the ghost of an ancient ice sheet, while another part is collapsing because its own internal ice is disappearing. The entire northern half of Canada is being reshaped by two powerful and opposing forces, both of which are legacies of ice. Zoom out, and the geography makes the mechanism clear. The communities most at risk, like Tuktoyaktuk, Aklavik, and Old Crow, are concentrated in the western Arctic and the Yukon and Northwest Territories. This region is underlain by what is known as the Mackenzie Valley Corridor, an area with particularly thick, ice-rich permafrost that is highly vulnerable to thaw. The infrastructure built there, the Dempster and Inuvik-Tuktoyaktuk highways, the pipelines, the towns themselves, were all placed directly on top of this geological weak point. The assumption was that the cold would last forever. The gamble was that the ice would hold. That gamble is now failing. The story of the disappearance is not in the future tense. It is an active process. The phrase "whole towns gone" from the title is, for now, an exaggeration for modern settlements. No town like Inuvik has vanished. But it accurately describes the severity of the threat. And it is historically true for some locations. The ancient coastal alluvial out settlement of Kittigazuit, once a major gathering site, has been largely lost to the same coastal erosion that now threatens Tuktoyaktuk. The land it was on is simply no longer there. The exaggeration of today is the potential reality of tomorrow. The question is no longer if these changes will happen, it is how fast they will accelerate, and what our response will be. In Tuktoyaktuk, the response is rock armor and a prayer for 60 more years. On the Dempster Highway, it is a constant cycle of patching and reinforcing, a fiscal black hole with no end in sight. For scientists like Dwayne Froese at the University of Alberta and teams at the Geological Survey of Canada, it is a frantic race to monitor, to map, and to understand the speed of the collapse before it outpaces our ability to adapt. And then there is the existential question buried within the permafrost data. For a century, we built a modern nation in the north. We laid down roads, runways, pipelines, and towns, all predicated on the idea of solid ground. We drew lines on maps and declared permanence. What does it mean when the map itself begins to melt? What does it mean for a nation when a piece of it the size of Western Europe begins to physically dissolve? For now, the rock walls are going up around Tuktoyaktuk. The construction crews are working against the clock of the seasons, trying to fortify a small patch of coastline against the Beaufort Sea. It is an act of defiance, not unlike the one made by the people of Aklavik 70 years ago. A declaration that they will not be moved. But this time, the force they are defying is not a government edict. It is the climate itself. It is the planet rebalancing itself. 3 questions hang over the Mackenzie Delta tonight. How long can engineered barriers hold back a melting continent? If a brand new highway, a pinnacle of modern engineering, is already failing, what hope is there for the older infrastructure it was meant to support? And what happens to us all when the carbon locked away for 50,000 years is released back into the sky? The ground beneath northern Canada is still thawing. The drunken forests are still leaning. The carbon is still seeping from the mud. And somewhere along the coast of the Beaufort Sea, another cubic meter of frozen earth, holding the history of a people, is right now crumbling into the ocean. The process is not waiting for our permission. It is happening in the silence between the storms. Most people who watch this long usually forget to subscribe. Just a thought.